Hey, my name is Sunny, and I will be doing a detailed analysis of Outlast and the Whistleblower DLC. This video will be pretty lengthy, and there will be heavy spoilers, so if you don't want it spoiled for you, I urge you to play through the game first and then come back to this video. Outlast is a first-person survival horror game developed and published by Red Barrel Studios. Outlast is the sole IP of Red Barrels, since they are a new independent company. It was first released on PC on September 4th, 2013, and then for all platforms later on. Outlast is about an investigative journalist, Miles Upshur, and him looking into some possible illegal testing done on the subjects at Mount Massive Asylum, owned by the Murkoff Corporation. The game starts off with an incredible strong sense of environment. You start outside, and you see an incredible structure. You pull into the Mount Massive Asylum, and it sets the tone and the mood for this game almost immediately. Most games prefer to have music in their introduction segments, even Amnesia, The Dark Descent, which I regard as one of my favorite horror games, and it is similar to this. That also had some music when the game started. The sounds are just the winds howling. There is no other sound than what the character makes. It quickly makes me uneasy and filled with dread. It didn't help when I would open my journal or notes and have some terrifying sounds lying in wait for me there as well. The sound department for this game did a tremendous job. The graphical quality for this game is very good for an independent studio, especially if it's their first game. They had used the Unreal Engine, and it really shows. Everything looks great. I have only one real complaint about it. When the camera is up, there's a large amount of haze and fuzziness on the screen. There's already about 4 or 5 things in the HUD already, but I think adding a fuzz filter to make it more believable did the exact opposite. I wanted to play the game with the camera down as often as I could, but I couldn't because if I didn't have my camera up, I would miss key notes. The night vision works just fine, both as a gameplay mechanic and how the visuals work. It doesn't have to look that good, and I think it's supposed to be that way, unlike the regular camera mode. Overall, this game looks great all the way through despite that nitpick. The gameplay for the game is also solid as well, though it is pretty minimal. Those who have played similar games like Amnesia would understand. There's a walk, run, crouch mechanic, a lean maneuver, and an interact button, but the main focus is on the camera work and manipulation. I'm playing on PC, so the left mouse button is to interact while the right mouse button is to raise and lower my camera. F on my keyboard is to activate the night vision, while the mouse scroll wheel is used to zoom in and out with the camera. I like the controls because they are simple, but more importantly, easy to remember when you get into a stressful or tense situation. While I didn't find this game particularly scary, though I did jump at some parts, I found it more stressful if anything. There's a certain feeling that you get when you're being chased by some insane prisoners and have to evade all of them. My hands get sweaty, and my heart starts to pound, and I get nervous. But I don't really think that's fear. I think that's stress or my body just being tense in that situation or environment. I do have to say though, I wish there was more horror involved than what's currently present. The potential is there, but the execution isn't. I want to be afraid to go into some rooms. I want to feel my heart pound and my hands shake in anticipation of the unknown, but it doesn't really happen. We have segments where we get our camera taken from us, and the only source to illuminate the dark corridors that we navigate through. But instead, we just go through dimly lit areas to recover our camera. That isn't horror, that's an illusion of horror. It banks off the idea of security rather than doubling down to scare us. When we find the camera again, there's a washing calm that comes over us, knowing that we can see in the dark again. What if we found out that the camera had completely broken, or the night vision doesn't work anymore? This would cause even further unease and make us play the game more cautiously. That is what I think should have happened. That would create more fear rather than seeking a moment to feel better. Frictional games, the creators of Penumbra, Amnesia, and Soma have this sort of mantra that they live by. Something is only scary the less you see of it. I feel like Red Barrels could have adopted this ideal into their game as well. I know that they want their games to be different, but they could have at least had the Wall Rider monster under this stipulation. That would at least vary the gameplay and mood of stressful fear of just getting to safety to environmental fear, where you are scared but nothing is outright scaring you at the moment. It's just the level design, music, sounds, and your own unease that makes it really scary. Then you catch a glimpse of the monster or enemy for a short time, and it would scare the pants right off you. Outlast had opted for a tense situation of fight or flight response in the gameplay, rather than the feeling of dread through just visual and audio horror. I think that's why Outlast is such a unique game in its own right. The only other game that I've played that's as stressful as Outlast is probably Five Nights at Freddy's, although Outlast is almost infinitely scarier. The simple gameplay layout allows me to handle myself through a tough and tense situation, so I appreciate the fine-tuning with the frame data of the doors opening and closing and the moving of objects in front of a door just in the nick of time. I felt like I grew some gray hairs while playing this game, which took me about 7 hours to complete both the main game and the Whistleblower DLC. Being a horror game, there are some cheap jump scares, and as someone who's playing with a high sensitivity mouse, that looks ridiculous on video. Here's what it looks like.
trying to go? Come back here! Meat.
Before I get back into the story, I'm going to talk about the battery system for a little bit. While I like the idea of having to scavenge to find batteries as your source to the darkness, I think they could have been done with the whole camera needing batteries just a little bit differently. Also, if there was an infrared mode, or an ultraviolet mode for different puzzles, or trying to find the wall rider, I think that would have been a good implementation of the modes. Then there wouldn't really need to be a reason to charge the entire camera just for the attachments. Or they could do another system with the cameras and have the entire camera need batteries. That would make it more worthwhile to go out of your way to collect them, rather than just to power the night vision. Even if you run out of batteries, or you run out of the batteries charging while you're recording, you can still see a small glow from the night vision attachment. So there's not that big of a penalty if you don't find it, or if you don't charge your camera. So back to the story. Once we actually get inside of the Mount Massive Asylum, we get to walk around for a little bit until being met by Chris Walker, this behemoth of a person. The backstory of Chris Walker is very interesting, but I found out about him through these comics that Red Barrels had made about the game. You should check them out if you haven't. They're free to read on their website and they're pretty amazing. He was shot through the mouth and incapacitated and then sent to Mount Massive, as he is a Murkoff employee and the litigation team did not want there on their reputation, since that company owned the therapist's office where Chris chose his victims. This would be a PR nightmare for Murkoff. He chose his victims through the therapist's office because he worked in the security room where he monitored the video cameras all day, and so he got to see his victims. So back in Mount Massive, when he finds you, he throws you down to the second floor. While this was an interesting introduction to Chris Walker, I feel like it could have expanded on his motivations within the asylum. This introduction was for you, the player, to get a jump scare, to meet Chris, and to get you to the first floor. If you look closely, every area of the second floor is blocked off, and you are being streamlined into this encounter to get to the first floor and start the game. However, the focus is quickly shifted to the self-proclaimed Father Martin. He tells you that you were given to him by God as the apostle. This is where the Wall Rider religion starts to set in. We don't know Father Martin's motives, but he's the only person to speak kindly to you, even though he drugs you and you wake up in a cell in the prison block later in the game. He leaves messages in blood for you to follow. Why couldn't he just come with you to usher you towards the end? I don't know. Maybe they didn't want the game to be only 10 minutes long. But the game does not explain the constant disappearance of Father Martin. The hiding mechanic is introduced pretty early in the game. I checked and I'm pretty sure you can only hide under a bed or in a locker. I thought you could hide behind some furniture, but it seems that the AI detection is pretty wonky and it only works some of the time. We get to a security room to try to unlock the front doors, but the good pastor decides to shut down the power. He says he's on our side, but it's hard to tell. The second, and the more used process, is that the way to move on is somehow hindered by something. It usually requires 2 of something. Right at this point, I had to hit 2 generator buttons before I could move on, hit the main generator button, and then progress. Later on in the game, it's 2 water sprinkler buttons before I turn on the main valve. Another thing this game does very predictably is the enemy encounters. Every time you make progress to the objective, an enemy is entered into the play area. It is almost always the case in every section of this game. It gets jarring and repetitive after a while, but luckily the environments feel fresh with the different areas that you visit throughout the asylum. Once you get the power back on, you get back to the security room to leave. Father Martin comes out and he drugs you, and he says he cannot leave until you report what happened here, and tell the world about it. Then we get to see footage of the Wall Rider. This is the second chapter of the game, where Miles wakes up in a prison cell and tries to find his way out.
Will you see it? Can you? Our Lord, the Wall Rider, tearing his truth into the unbelievers. The only way out of this place is the truth. Accept the gospel, and all doors will open before you.
We meet these 2 twins. They don't have names, but they're very interesting to me because they have this sort of hive mind psychopathy going on. As in, they would finish each other's sentences by describing how they would kill you. They were different from the other enemies because they seem to be under Father Martin's rule and is not allowed to harm you. But I think they call it bullshit later on and try to kill you. They are terrifying because they just walk towards you. Other enemies hit you a few times before you die, but they both have a machete and will instantly kill you once they get close. Later on in the game, once you evade them, they stop becoming hostile towards you. As we go further on, we are taken into the sewers, where we see Wall Rider written in blood everywhere. There is also a document down there that talks about how Father Martin is saying God isn't real, but the Wall Rider is, so we praise to him. Religious fanaticism is a powerful thing in asylums, apparently. The only issue is that they try to implement the Walrider as a religion, but it doesn't seem like it. There may be 5 or so people that yell Walrider, and then there's Father Martin himself. I would break down the parallels of common religions and the Walrider religion, but there isn't enough information for just one person to preach everything to the main character. It seems as if the idea of the cult was an afterthought, and there was no method to the madness of how or why Father Martin was doing what he was. It's annoying, but the main objective is still to escape, so the plot is pretty weak for most of the time. We learn the backstory through documents that we find, but there is such a rich environment that they could have built themselves in the main narrative rather than relying on the documents. However, leaving the sewers to go into the mail ward is my favorite part of the game. We pick up the document written by Rick Trager. The document says that he was an amateur surgeon and that he would test on people in the facility. After picking up that document, we are aggressively chased through the asylum. There was an issue I had with this chase, and it got you to a pit that you were supposed to jump over, but somehow I didn't make it the first time. And I thought it was odd since there's such a great deal of magnetism to the ledges when a player is jumping to the ledge. As I'm getting chased, a voice comes on the intercom telling me to get in the dumbwaiter, which is not the waiter at the restaurant that you like, but rather a small elevator that carries small things like food or dishes. I don't know why they named it that. We meet Rick Trager. This seemed like a trap, regardless of who came up, but I think he just wanted some people to experiment on. His backstory is interesting as well, and it was also explained in the comics. He was actually a business executive for the Wernicke Corporation, and he did some unsavory things at the office, which resulted in a brawl with another agent, and his hair ended up in a shredder and tore up his scalp. He was then sent to Mount Massive after it was over. It isn't clear why he started experimenting on the patients when he got there, but it seemed like he has done it for a long time. It said in the comics that he was an amateur surgeon, but he was really just a business executive. The timeline for this game is pretty odd, but it seems that everything was normal about 2 hours prior, according to the Whistleblower DLC. Unless no one gave a shit about the asylum, and how everyone ran it was still the same. It is after the guards were killed and everyone evacuated that we are to assume that everything went to hell. So my theory is that they let Trager experiment to gain medical research, similar to the Nazi and Japanese doctors in World War II, where they would experiment to see how long someone would last underwater, or how long it takes for someone to bleed out. This is the lightest of the crimes that they had committed. What they did is absolutely sickening. However, it actually advanced modern medicine practice and clinical practice very, very far, more than we could ever believe. I know it may not be what people like, but that's how it is. I say that to say that's probably why Trager is doing what he wants at the asylum. They're already testing on people, so why not have another person to run similar tests? Trager ends up torturing you, but you escape. What is immersion breaking about this section is that Trager cuts off a finger on each hand, and when he breaks free, he doesn't attempt to find a bandage to wrap it up or anything. Yet, the camera is still important. While the escape sequence was well done, and when Trager dies in the elevator, it is ruined by a stupid note that Miles writes. It doesn't say anything about getting lured, captured, or tortured. It just makes a joke instead. As we continue through the kitchen, we see a patient sitting on the cart, panting. He says he had to burn it down, so Miles is tasked with finding the sprinkler system, where he has to activate 2 buttons and then a main switch, just like we discussed earlier. This time around, it was much more jarring than before. After dodging Chris, we exit the asylum to the courtyard to look for Father Martin. After walking down and avoiding enemies, we get to the chapel, but first we have to find 3 fuses to unlock the dumbwaiter in the laundry room so we can get a key to unlock the upper floor. I felt at this point they were just adding filler for no reason. It was an almost unnecessary implementation of fetch quests that were plagued within this game. Further on, Miles loses his camera at one point, but it really isn't that bad. It just sets up for a jump scare or two, but I can see some people enjoying this break in the gameplay. This is where we eventually run back into the killer twins who decide to attack Miles, but it's pretty easy to get around them. As I walked into the theater, there was another key that I had to fetch to the chapel door. As I entered the chapel, I saw Father Martin being crucified. He tells you to watch him being burned alive. He dies so he can be reborn as the Walrider and save them, be their shepherd kind of thing. He tells you that recording this penultimate act is important, and that he fixed the elevator so we should be free. Penultimate means second to last, so by him telling us to use the elevator to be free, and saying that inspecting this is only the penultimate task is contradictory, because there will be more than one task to complete if you don't count the basic task of walking outside. Unless Father Martin had just happened to say something incorrectly, but he didn't. We go down to the elevator, and we get ready to get out of this hell on Earth, but the elevator keeps going. We finally arrive at the underground research facility, because every big mega corporation has one, so Murkoff and Umbrella Corporation must be good friends. We meet the Walrider yet again, and it saves us from Chris Walker. It doesn't really explain how Chris got there, and I don't know, but he was killed in a pretty spectacular way by the Walrider. Then we meet the man behind the curtains, Dr. Wernickle. He said that he had retired and he was just doing some charity work for Mount Massive, but he is 90-something years old now. As it turns out, he is behind the whole Project Walrider experiment, and Billy Hope, the first test subject, was the only success of the project. The experiment was to use nanomachines within the human body. That is why most of the patients look mutilated, because the nanomachines destroyed their body. In order to control the nanomachines, they needed to go into a lucid dream state. Cue in the morphogenic engine. This machine allows the patient to go into a dreamlike state and it gets filled with the machines. Once that process is completed, they can control the hive mind of the nanomachines just like a body can. That is what killed Chris Walker. The nanomachines took form of its host, Billy Hope, who was actually stuck inside of a sphere, completely unconscious. Dr. Wernickle told us to kill Billy by removing the life support from the morphogenic engine that Billy is attached to. This is the last time we have to activate 2 of something in this game, so that's a plus. After disabling it and killing Billy, the Walrider cluster still exists. I still don't understand how it exists, since the host was killed, but the machines still seem to operate normally. Miles gets beat up pretty bad after killing Billy, but then the cluster seems to have disappeared. So again, we make ourselves to the exit for the final time. Here's where the plot gets a little weird. The doors open and a private military group uses Miles as target practice, but somehow he becomes the host. Billy was the only successful host in a large number of test subjects, and he suffered at the hands of the morphogenic engine for a very long time. Miles was not even subject to the engine, he merely looked at the machine a few times during the game. How can the machine possess him and act on its own? Billy was attacking everyone to protect Dr. Wernicke, who he considered a father. But what about after he died? If we are to assume that Miles somehow survived the broken bones and the volley of gunshots, it must mean that the nanomachine repaired his body, or just enough for it to act as the host of the cluster. I believe it to be a mess of an ending, because it is really hard to see the nanomachines work in their own will with nothing powering it, and it becomes more convoluted with the ending of the Whistleblower DLC, which I will now go over. The game starts with the main character, Wayland Park, being tied to a chair and getting ready to be subjected to the morphogenic engine. Then it cuts back 2 hours prior to show that Wayland Park, a temporary IT technician, just leaking information to Miles Upshur, the character of the main game, and telling him how awful it is there. What he was typing was the same information we got at the beginning of the first game. He gets called into the testing chamber to do his job, and this portion is to show us on how unnerved Wayland is about the whole program. He eventually gets caught leaking information, and then the game begins. The release of the Walrider is known in this game as the Murkoff incident, where everyone just starts to die. 2 hours had passed, so Miles should be arriving pretty soon as well. The Walrider project goes haywire and all the prisoners and patients are released. They start taking over Mount Massive. Wayland overhears some guards talking about a shortwave radio, and that becomes the main objective for about half the game. After moving through the basement and running into Billy Hope, we meet the next enemy that chases us, Frank Manera, a cannibal who had trouble eating when he was in prison there, and he was subjected to force feeding for his meals. When Wayland and Frank meet, Frank claims that Wayland's flesh is his and proceeds to chase you through the game for about 45 minutes, or until you get to the next section of the game. There's no real reason why he's so aggressive, but I suppose the developers didn't want to keep using Chris Walker since he's busy chasing Miles around. Unlike the original game, this DLC relies on just getting one item to progress, like one key or to activate one switch. It wasn't trying to elongate the gameplay anymore, so it seemed a bit more open environment. I'm mostly talking about the outside section, where I actually got lost a few times. The courtyard segment was interesting because there was thick fog outside, and the night vision was almost completely useless. Thinking about it now, the pacing of the Whistleblower was very good. It takes you in the reverse pattern of the original game, starting in the lab, and then ending at the front door. The DLC takes you through a more varied environment than the original as well. Once we finally reach the radio, another predictable thing happens, and Jeremy Blair, the man who admitted Wayland into Mount Massive, is smashing it with a baton. He leaves before Chris Walker could kill him, and the game continues from there. My favorite part about the DLC was where we meet Eddie Gluskin, or Gluskin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. We get to the female ward and overhear some women talking about offering a goat for their guilt and gender. The offering is to Eddie. He's as interesting as Rick Trager, the surgeon. Eddie was sexually abused by his father and uncle, and turned into a misogynist serial killer who murdered and mutilated women. We see him taking male patients and turning them into women. Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. But it gets worse. The gymnasium in the game is a trophy room for Eddie, where over 20 bodies are hung by the neck, all mutilated. We try to hide in a locker and end up being kidnapped. So we wake up to see Eddie turning males into females, and that's where we end up on the chopping block. To say in the least grotesque way I can, he wants to remove what makes us men and replace it with a deep cut, which he then will use to get us pregnant. Red Barrel Studios, I give you points for creativity, but someone in your writing department really needs therapy. Luckily, Eddie is attacked and we escape, until we are caught again and hung, but we wiggle out and Eddie dies in a freak accident. After leaving that area, we see a church in the distance on fire. Through this scene is how we know that the Miles storyline and the Wayland storyline overlap. That's why it's hard to call it a prequel. Further on, we see some private military personnel standing over the corpse of Trager, asking if he is dead. This really gives us a great feeling of the world of Mount Massive, and how some things come back. I'm really glad that the church and Trager made an appearance. We finally get to the front door, and see our old friend Jeremy Blair. He's feigning being hurt so he can stab Wayland. Just before he kills Wayland, Miles, in possession of the Wall Rider, kills Jeremy. For some reason, the Wall Rider tries to kill Wayland as well, but fails. Why would Miles want to stop Wayland? Once Wayland escapes, he is talking to a shadowy figure, which in the game wiki refers to him as Julian, as in Julian Assange. I thought this was a nice little touch on the developer's side. He tells Wayland that he will lose everything if he uploads the video, but he might even get some justice. He uploads it, and then the credits roll. The DLC was pretty underwhelming as a whole, but it had great variety in level design. My one wish is that they could have implemented another gameplay mechanic so it doesn't feel like we're playing Miles from the first game. When I was reading documents, I had to remember that I was playing Wayland and not Miles, since they do the exact same thing, except Wayland has more fingers. Overall, I really like the game as a whole. They could have provided more ways to get to a checkpoint rather than activate 2 of something, but that wasn't a big deal to me. What I was really hoping for and didn't get to see is something similar to the movie Shutter Island, where the main character also starts to go crazy. There was only one point I remember one of the characters starts to lose it, and that's Wayland, when Eddie was killed. The note we get reads as follows. He's dead. The amateur surgeon, father-to-be, husband. His guts shredded and pulled from his belly. I'm trying not to laugh. Oh God, Lisa, I swear to you I'm trying. That is great character development. After seeing the things that they have seen, it would be very hard not to lose grip with reality. But the game never quite expands on that. They could have had Miles go crazy, and the plot would still work, but I think that was the biggest waste of potential in the game. If we witnessed such destructive horrors on our consciousness, we would be damaged. That's just how our brains process trauma. But both Miles and Wayland tough it out to the very end, even though the entire game tries to sell us the idea of them going crazy as well. They aren't insane, because that wouldn't fit the narrative of the overall story that they're trying to accomplish. This is just the illusion of insanity. It could add much more depth if insanity was a mechanic in the game. It could be even scarier as a game. Instead of just survival horror, it could have been labeled as psychological survivor horror. It has a nice ring to it. But despite my critiques, Red Barrels had made an amazing game based on their skills with the gameplay mechanics and their relatively strong storyline, so I have very high hopes for Outlast 2. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. If you did, leave a like and subscribe for more content. And if you're feeling especially frisky, leave a comment on what game I should do an analysis over next. Goodbye and thank you for watching.